Hello and welcome to this audio commentary for A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original 1984 version from Wes Craven. You should be looking at a 91-minute version of this film. Sometimes I tend to think this is a 1985 film because of the UK release, but I believe it was originally out in November 1984 in the United States. And we'll cover a lot about the origins of this, about the cultural impact, and we're also going to go into some of the deeper readings of this film, so hopefully you're going to get something out of it, something you haven't heard before. Seeing Robert Shaye there, very influential on it, how it became a franchise, but we'll talk about that in a minute. For the moment, I just want you to focus on that very tight, constricted framing. You're not seeing the full picture, you've got a huge amount of black space. Now, is that just a standout? Is that just because the extremely tight focus is very helpful for the very low budget that they were working with? Partially. Partially it is. But once the title drops, you're going to get another use of it. By the way, that opening sequence wonderfully paid tribute to in Terrifier from 2016. Now look at Tina here. She starts off on that white mat. You're wondering where she is. She looks like she's been superimposed. But then she moves into a frame. The white frames her in another constricted square, very much like Freddy's opening sequence. And it's sort of implying that she is constricted in his realm. It's that visual code. She is trapped and trapped in an area that Freddy controls. That is a nifty bit of filmmaking and symbolism that maybe is a little harder to catch here. But that level of detail and thought is going to help A Nightmare on Elm Street stand out very much. You saw a few credits there, interesting ones. So, introducing Johnny Depp, very memorably. Joseph Whipp would show up again in Scream as a police sergeant, and Lynn Shay, who is a teacher in this, would appear in Wes Craven's New Nightmare as a nurse. And there's a very interesting nurse cameo in this as well. We'll get to that later. Of course, Johnny Depp was not originally going to be in this. He was not originally looking at this film at all, but he was brought along to the audition by his friend Jackie Earle Haley, later to play Freddy Krueger in the 2010 remake of this, probably best known to you all as Rorschach, I believe, but a very good actor in his own right. He stars in a very good film called Little Children, with Patrick Wilson and I believe Kate Winslet. Now to set the scene there, credit for Charles Bernstein. Yes, excellent music in this film. Very 80s synth, but also nice and dreamlike. It's sort of a haunting, sort of childlike lullaby melody going on there, and a lot of it. Let's talk a little bit about the beginnings of this, sets the scene. So Nightmare on Elm Street was Craven's 6th film, not his 5th. And whilst you might be thinking of Nightmare on Elm Street as this massive success for an absolute icon of the genre, we have to actually set it in context, and this film was produced by Wes Craven when he was down in the doldrums. He was not on a career high, he was actually in a career low when he made this. It's probably hard to imagine. Now, he originally, when he was doing this, he had written it years ago, as is standard. He had filmed The Hills Have Eyes Part 2. Also, note the crucifix there, very interesting. So he'd filmed a sequel to The Hills Have Eyes, and that was in autumn 1983, but it was just sitting on a shelf. I think people weren't super happy with it. He was kind of having a dry spell while he needed another movie. He had to write it himself because people weren't really bringing him the offers that he wanted. He had just had a series of disappointments, so Deadly Blessing, which had given him a bigger budget of about $3 million. That was made for just under $3 million. Swamp Thing was made for about $2.5 million. Both of those really disappointed. United Artists were not giving him any offers after that. So Craven needed work. I love that girl on the far left there. She looks absolutely hilarious. And by the way, in this, you're clearly doing a fade from the dream world to the real world. That tree is going to kind of cut you off there. It's a nice technique. But that fading from dreams to reality in the interplay is obviously crucial to the film. It's going to start with a dream, it's going to end with a dream. We're going to have to ask, was it all a dream? Anyway, so Craven needed work. He did a major rewrite of this, and he set about trying to find distribution for this. So he shops it around and he finds a very small outfit, New Line Cinema, under Bob Shaye. Now, New Line was tiny. It was getting the license to do a couple of niche distributions in the US, but it wasn't a big house. And that's why they couldn't get a big budget for this. This film was made for somewhere between 1.1 million and 1.8 million. And most importantly, to get this made, Wes Craven had to sell all the rights to this film. So he really didn't make much money off this when it became an absolutely massive success for New Line Cinema. And by huge success, I mean a box office taking of $57 million, which is not bad going for a 1.1 million investment. Now notice back then Johnny Depp, as Glenn was saying, you can just wake right up when you're having a bad dream. He's going to change his position in a bit, but it's interesting that he slips that idea in that you've got a lot more control over the dream realm than you think you do. He's going to do some research and come up with another option as we go, but never mind. So right now we just want to point out the parents here, they're absent. Where are they? The teenagers are having the run of the house. That is going to be a major theme. I just want you to notice how the adults are portrayed in this. How they're often sort of out of the picture, or they're incompetent, or they're irresponsible. But in the case of this scene, I think it's just funny. And I think something that's really easy to overlook is how funny Nightmare on Elm Street is. There are some really good jokes in it, some really quite subtle ones, as well as this kind of, more broad gag here with the sound effects. Very easy to overlook that. Okay. This is going to be a really tight film. As I said, it's 91 minutes long. It is not messing around. We'll see some examples of just how trimmed this script is. Now, some of that is the budget, but there's also the aspect of Craven had made six films. Nightmare on Elm Street would actually come out before The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, and then with the massive success of this, I think that's what got Hills Have Eyes Part 2 off the shelf, to try and cash in on that. But Craven had quite a lot of experience, not just in the films he'd got out, so the very low budget stuff like The Last House on the Left and then The Hills Have Eyes in 1977. But he'd also done quite a lot of TV work. Really have to emphasise that whatever we tend to think of Craven as the sort of master of the genre, he really didn't have his pick of projects. He really was very much a working director. Let's get a little detail in there, just building up the picture of Freddy. It's not overplayed. We're about 7 minutes in and they're already dropping the details. Let's talk about how he came up with this idea. We're going to talk about the origins of Elm Street, because we're going to have to ask ourselves, why is it even called A Nightmare on Elm Street? There is no Elm Street in this movie. No one lives on Elm Street. But we'll touch on that in a minute. First we'll just look at the name. Now there are two Elm Streets that could be responsible. One is the Elm Street that Wes Craven lived on whilst he was studying at Wheaton College, where he was looking into literature mostly, but also lucid dreaming. He would work in academia for a while before becoming a film editor and later a filmmaker. And while he was doing that, while he was working as a professor, he got interested in sort of making the movies himself. He had his students create little independent, less structured films with the equipment that the university had. That's where he got the idea. But I found it really interesting that he was studying dreaming and the psychology of dreaming, so maybe we'll see where that comes in. And the other Elm Street, very relevant to this film, is the one that JFK was assassinated on in 1963. Now, does that sound like a reach? You might think, am I reaching? No, that is coming directly from Craven. One of the sources I used in researching this was John Woolley's Wes Craven, The Man and His Nightmares. A quite compact biography. If you can, look for an edition that's been updated, as I do not have one that has been updated since Wes Craven's early death in 2015. Rather sad, got to say. And so the JFK Elm Street, that is going to have relevance to the wider interpretations of this film. We should also mention that, obviously, you might have heard that Wes Craven saw a story about refugees from South Asia. I believe they were Hmong, who had settled in the US and had started dying in their sleep. Quite a mysterious affair. If you're interested, there is a wonderful channel called Shrouded Hand who I did a collaboration with, who has a video on the incident that inspired this, if you want to know a bit more about that, how he got the idea. And then there's further details that are detailed in John Woolley's book. That is a nightmare from very early on in Craven's life of seeing a man in a hat whilst he was living in an urban apartment. His parents had separated, he was in a high-rise flat, and he was looking out onto the street when he couldn't sleep. And he saw a creepy guy in a coat wearing a hat like Freddy's looking up at him and just staring at him, and he was terrified this man was going to bust in through the house and get him. That's where we get some of Freddy Krueger's appearance from. Wes Craven also had the pleasure of being bullied by a kid named Freddy, who immediately stopped when Wes finally stood up to him. That's an interesting one. Has obviously got some relevance to the finale of this film. And lastly, I will mention that the name Freddy Krueger is coming from Krug, which is the lead villain in Last House on the Left, which in turn was named from Krupp, who were a weapons manufacturer for the mid-century Germans. There's quite a spell to go through there. It's kind of dangerous world the kids are in there, isn't it? Like Rod's use of the knife being brought out over absolutely nothing. It's a little over the top. It's showing that the kids are getting into some murky areas without their parents' involvement. The suburbs are not a safe space. That is an idea that was very prevalent in horror, especially slasher horror at the time. Now, this isn't a slasher horror. The director and star are very clear to emphasise that, but obviously it's working in that environment. I thought that little line that Johnny Depp dropped, morality sucks. What a statement. Now, while Glenn may be very clean-cut, you kind of see that Tina there is being sort of lightly pressured into being with Rod. Like, I think she was sort of indicating she didn't necessarily want to go and sleep with him that night. And he's obviously a bit more dangerous, he's also Latino, and you have to wonder, is that significant? Is that significant consciously or consciously in regards to what kind of situations that teenagers are getting themselves in without their parents' supervision, where they're out to lunch? If that sounds a little conservative, maybe a little spicy for Wes Craven, I'm going to lean that anything in that direction is going to be more subconscious. Some feature like The People Under the Stairs is very much in line with that sort of modern racial equality messaging that you tend to see. But it's interesting if it comes in subconsciously. And when I say The People on the Stairs fits into that mould of modern, current-day racial politics, what I mean is it's very easily seen as a white's bad, black's good issue. You have the borderline albino white landlord, incestuous couple, and you have the young black children who are just sort of oppressed, etc. I think it's no accident that Jordan Peele has been wanting to remake The People Under the Stairs for a few years, although that project doesn't seem to be going anywhere, so I don't know if that's still a going concern. I also have to note that the name Rod is also quite telling. I don't think that's exactly subtle given how sexually voracious he is, that he has the name Rod. But we'll move on from that. You're going to get a little bit of the fantastic effects showcased here. This is so simple. It is just the fact the bedroom set there has a latex sheet for the wall painted, and so Robert Englund as Freddy can just manipulate that very nicely. It's such a simple effect, but it really works well, setting up a kind of idea of the plasticity between the dream world and the real world. When you sort of ask yourself, when was the last time you saw a crucifix in a movie? Isn't that kind of amazing? Obviously, it's referenced in that famous nursery rhyme from the start, the 5-6 grab your crucifix. But it's just interesting to see it. Wes Craven came from, while we're talking about his leanings, I wouldn't really put him as a liberal or a conservative. He's hard to pigeonhole. He came from a very strict Baptist background, so straight, you know, he never really saw a movie until he was in his 20s. But at the same time, whilst he moved away from that, while he became non-religious, he didn't recognise that there was an impact of doing that. That culturally it leaves a bit of a void, and he will talk about that to an extent in this film. Now, looking at Tina here, that outfit, quite noticeable. That is making her quite vulnerable. She's got this formal shirt on top, but the bare legs make her look vulnerable. It's quite a good choice. The fact that she would also go outside after hearing a weird noise. It's very much dream logic, isn't it? You've seen something, some kind of stimulus, and you just sort of follow it without thinking. So if you hear a noise, okay, I'll go and check what it was. If I have a trail, I will follow it. That's what she's doing. It's dream logic, but it's also horror movie logic. I really like to look at Nightmare on Elm Street as a sort of using dream logic and film logic together and pointing out how similar they are. When Freddy there says, "This is God," I think that's one of those key statements that Wes Craven is kind of hinting that in the absence of the old culture, something else has to step into its place. So when you have a desanctified culture, without the religion, you get something else stepping in. This is God now. As I say, Craven, hard to pigeonhole in any kind of modern left-right dichotomy. Something else I want to note in that really interesting sequence, that was actually shot by Craven's friend and collaborator, I want to say. His friend and occasional colleague, Sean Cunningham. Sean Cunningham is going to get a thanks at in the end credits of this movie, but he shot that alley sequence as a B unit for Wes Craven. Cunningham is best known for creating the Friday the 13th series, I should say alongside Victor Miller, as that's the subject of a long-running lawsuit that sort of paralysed the series, meaning we do not have a Friday the 13th Part 13, although I gather that was recently settled. Anyway, now looking at this is wonderfully creative. When Tina is able to defy gravity like this, you notice that, by the way, even though she's just in her underwear there, I like how non-sexualised it is. That could have easily been used for those very exploitative shots, and they don't do it. Now, it won't be surprising how they managed to do this. That set is a rotating room. Rod was strapped into the corner there, so he was held in place. A camera was in a fixed position, and then the room was rotated. I have wondered if there's something in the fact that Nancy wears a shirt with 11 on it, and then Glenn later wears a shirt with 10 on it. I don't think it is, so I think it's just a coincidence. Now, obviously, that set was difficult to do. The lighting was really nice. All those blue tones, which we'll get a lot of in this movie, they help the red really stand out, and that nasty bright red stands out wonderfully. That was an expensive set, so they are going to make quite a lot of use of it. You'll see props get reused a lot in this movie. Very economical, because when you've only got a budget of 1.3 million in an effects-heavy movie, you have to be economical. That wonderful chap we have there is John Saxon. I had recorded a commentary already about Black Christmas 1974, where he shows up, and it's an absolute delight to see him again.
What was she doing there?
The photo on the desk makes it clear that the relationship is there between them. He's her father, and they have divorced. As I said, this film is going to make a lot out of the relationship between children and their parents, specifically with the boomers. John Saxon is such a great presence in this, and I'd say he's probably the best of the parents, not just in terms of acting, but he comes off the best. We're obviously going to see that the mother is not as good. She is a rampant alcoholic. There are going to be some interesting choices with that. Now, going back to the origins of Nightmare on Elm Street, there is an interesting Faustian aspect to it. I am not reaching, I promise you. So while Craven was doing a major rewrite of this film to get it ready for proper production, he was doing the sound mixing for The Hills of Eyes Part 2, and he was also doing pre-production on a TV-only movie called Invitation to Hell. And that's a sort of interesting Faustian precursor to this idea of basically you're moving into the suburbs, you've got all the material goods, and the devil is very much in charge. It is, I wouldn't say it's a classic, but I do wonder if working on that gave Craven some prompts that came to influence A Nightmare on Elm Street and some of the ideas that are running under this film. Now, Invitation to Hell as a TV movie on a low budget, it is not a dream project, but as I've been saying, Craven is not a big hitter. Demand for his work waxed and waned, and he always had to fight for his projects. He was a working director, and he didn't even want to be a horror director. He kind of fits in awkwardly with the oeuvre, and we're going to see that Nightmare on Elm Street really goes out of its way to differentiate itself from the horror movies at the time, especially the slasher genre. As Craven said himself, he did draw a real line in his mind between television and features. With features, I felt like you really had to be Wes Craven. With television, you earn your money and go, so he was just doing it for the money because he needed to. Note the open drinking there. Nancy, oddly enough, is going to take a sip, which stands out as a bit odd to me. Now, parental response there is to both turn off the news to kind of protect Nancy, hide it from her, but also to protect herself with booze so she doesn't have to be aware of it, doesn't have to deal with it. Very odd. So back to in the Faustian aspect, in Elm Street, there is a realm where you can do anything, but it's run by a pseudo-devil, by a stand-in for the devil, you know, who even says that he is God. In this film, parents have got their wish illegitimately, which we'll discuss later in some depth, but they're also now paying. That is the Faustian aspect. And I do think Invitation to Hell probably ended up having an influence on this that wouldn't have been there otherwise. That shot always makes me think of Donnie Darko, that weird guy in the suit. But it's not there just for randomness. There's another echo in this I find of The Last House on the Left. And Rod there, he really looks like Krug to me. He reminds me of Krug, the villain from The Last House on the Left. I gather, you know, that jacket and hair combo was a style at the time. But it does strike me as very reminiscent of it. This is also going to be a case where Nancy is going to be rejecting her parents' advice. The dad's there because he set it up to protect his daughter, and he's going to get blamed for it, but how is he wrong? How is John Saxon wrong for protecting his daughter? I don't personally see it. But this is a film where the parents and the children are going to disagree on the proper course of action consistently. Right, so I mentioned the idea of asking, why is this called A Nightmare on Elm Street when there is no Elm Street? Maybe easily missed. Let's go into it. So Elm Street was the site of the JFK assassination, which is kind of a stand-in for the loss of national innocence. I think Craven was very much in favour of JFK. Oh, that teacher there is Lynn Shay. Lynn Shay, who was Bob Shay's wife and will turn up as a nurse in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Listen to what she's saying there. Talking about something rotten in the human spirit, rotten within us. Bear that in mind because Freddy's going to slice himself open very soon and show he's full of maggots. That is a nice little setup. This is a great sequence. Really getting the idea of dream logic. I'll break things up just to comment on it where appropriate. So as I was saying, following JFK's assassination on Elm Street in 1963, it's a turning point for America, and also a turning point for a very distant regime change effort in Vietnam. Notice how everyone freezes. Excellent capturing of dream logic. The sound sort of melts away and becomes instinct indifferent. Everyone absolutely frozen because they don't matter anymore, as I was saying. So with JFK assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson takes control And very quickly, 2 days after, on 24th of November 1963, LBJ says the battle against communism must be joined with strength and determination. And US troops arrive early on the ground early in 1964. Now, Vietnam is kind of key to understanding this film, because the big fear was that conscription was happening, conscription was hurting the young, and you can really see it as a case where the older generation are betraying the younger generation. I think that's very much what Craven believed. It's their war, but the children are being forced to fight it. They're conscripted to fight for a foreign war that they didn't want to be in. Now, easily missed on the first showings there, that very characteristic jumper, part of Freddy's uniform, but also the weird aspect of, why are there all the leaves in the hall? Why is there wind blowing inside the hallway? So I think you can say Craven is portraying it as the older generation betraying the younger generation. His generation. They were conscripted for Vietnam to fight in a foreign war they didn't want to be in. And that's a fairly common criticism. I do think here Craven may be pretty blinkered, because his parents' generation had the exact same problem in World War II. It's not widely known, but prior to national propaganda campaigns in both official government announcements and unofficially in cinema, just look at Casablanca. In 1940, 93% of American respondents to a Gallup survey said they thought the US should not declare war on Germany and not join the fighting. Americans, by and large, did not want to take part in World War II. However, once the US passed the Selective Service Training and Service Act and then entered World War II, the draft terms extended through the duration of the fighting, and by the end of the war in 1945, 50 million men between 18 and 45 had been forced to register for the draft, and 10 million had been inducted into the military. So the Vietnam generation, they were not unique in this. This is a long-running program. Don't you love liberal democracies? There is that shot of the maggots I told you about. These kind of elements of surreality, they're great dream logic, just as is her following the trail of blood. I want you to notice, by the way, in all the dream sequences, people do tend to be descending. When you're getting into Freddy's realm, you tend to be descending, which is part of the sort of infernal aspect of him. As I was saying, I see a huge amount of relevance in this film, a huge amount of messaging about the Vietnam War. Now, Vietnam is particularly relevant when you look at Freddy Krueger's design. We talked about where he gets his hat from and his name from, but what about the burns? Now, in the story, it's because he was burnt to death, but that is also kind of reminiscent for Vietnam of the napalm attacks that so thoroughly stuck in the public's minds. Everyone saw those photos of people on fire and burning. I really think that is why Craven chose to show him burned, reflecting what the teacher said about people being rotten. This is so amazing. When you're doing the dream logic, you don't even question that. You just go down a school hallway, through a curtain, and you're in the boiler room nightmare zone. And then she turns around and the same curtain leads nowhere. It is excellent dream logic. It's so well done. We also want to note there that the student in the body bag being dragged through the halls also then becomes really symbolic of Vietnam in the context we've just given. Now, let's just talk about another aspect that's easy to miss. I said Wes Craven really wants to distinguish himself from the other horror movies. And one of the ways he does this is in the fact that Krueger has this strong personality, okay? He's wisecracking, he's making these sadistic jokes. That is a sharp contrast to the deathly silent, basically personality-free villains of Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers from Halloween. I think that's a fairly obvious point. But I also want to note how many times he injures himself. He cut off his fingers and then he just cut himself open. Now, why is he doing that? Partly, it's so you can get a good effect, yes. But the other aspect is more subtle. If Freddy is just injuring himself for fun, you're getting the idea across that he's not going to be someone that you can just stab or shoot. That's not going to solve the problem. So it's subtly undermining. You're starting to think, okay, my usual horror movie solutions, they aren't going to work on Freddy Krueger. I also really like the continuity in the end of that scene, that just as she was asked for a hall pass in her dream, her teacher asks her for a hall pass. That was very nice continuity.
Well, then how do you know that somebody else was there?
Now, what we've seen so far with both Tina's dream and Nancy's dream there is setting the rules established that we need to be aware of, that what happens in the dream does matter. And that's really crucial to this. In so many films where you have the dream sequence, it is a throwaway scare. It's something where we can show something for a quick shot, maybe even get it in the trailer, but it doesn't have to have any impact on the story. It's a cheap scare. Nightmare on Elm Street makes darn sure that everything matters. Seeing as we also got extended looks at Freddy there in the boiler room, I'll just float another thing. In John Woolley's Wes Craven, The Man and His Nightmares, the author floated the idea that the finger knives are significant as an Old Scratch reference. You're often seeing them sort of scratching along. Old Scratch is a term for the devil that I think is a bit more popular in England than elsewhere. I'm not sure about that myself. I have my own interpretation of the finger knives, but we will get to that later. We'll get to that a fair bit later. Now, I have talked about how Wes Craven's Baptist upbringing, which is very, very big on emphasising the importance of avoiding a very literal hell, how that's had an influence on him and will feed through into this film. But I thought it would also be interesting to feed in what Wes Craven himself says when he when he stars as himself in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. So this is him playing him, reading lines he has written. And in that scene he says, "I can tell you about what the nightmares are about. They're about this entity, whatever you want to call it. It's old, very old, and it's taken different forms in different times. The only thing that stays the same about it is what it lives for." Heather asks, "What's that?" And he says, "Killing innocents, one way or the other." Craven at this point might be thinking that the devil is fulfilling a similar function. He is thinking of the importance of story. These things really matter. They do have an impact, but they have to be taken very seriously. We'll talk a little bit more about Wes Craven's New Nightmare later. Now, this scene is another wonderful one. It's going to mess with our expectations. It is going to make wonderful use of the dream logic to challenge all the assumptions and give us a wonderful surprise. And all credit to the effects team for this, because they have set things that look up so convincing that when they do the effect, the sort of reality warping effect, we are not ready for it. You know how there is basically no pause there? We go straight to the glove coming up out of the water. Already, you do not expect that, but it's also very quick. There's little time wasting. As I said, this is 91 minutes. There's an extremely tight script, and I think we only actually get about 89 minutes of film. And this went on to inspire a wonderful scene in a much overlooked film, Body Snatchers from 1993. The second remake of the Invasion of the Body Snatchers film, which is rather fantastic. Highly recommend it. I think their bath scene was very much inspired by this. Heather Langenkamp there is about 19, and she gets this really cool line later when she's sort of worrying about the effects of all the sleep deprivation. She looks in the mirror and says, "God, I look almost 20. I thought that was really funny. It's also a bit of a contrast to all the Dawson's casting that we tend to see. I have just recorded a commentary for Fright Night, and in that you have people well into the mid to late 20s playing teenagers. But, you know, if it was good enough for Buffy, why not? Now, Langenkamp currently works, interestingly, as a special effects coordinator with her husband. They have a company called AFX Studios. And so she's been under layers of sort of animatronics and rubber, and absolutely unrecognisable in a lot of films recently. Some of the newer Star Wars ones had her as effectively just a special effects creation. However, she did come back to acting very recently in Mike Flanagan's Midnight Club. Now, I cannot recommend that at all, I'm afraid. That was an absolutely terrible series, but I'm not going to deny it was really lovely to see Heather Langenkamp in that. She had a sort of it kind of felt like seeing some horror royalty, and it was very touching to see her once again playing a counsellor, just as she will in Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Now this is a little bit of fun. The Evil Dead tribute exchange, the Craven Raimi Wars. You may know about this, you may not. By the way, what the heck is that puppet in the background? It is so creepy. Anyway, let's talk about that. It does look a bit ideal, that house, doesn't it? This bit reminds me of Scream so much. I swear the opening of Scream has to be a very deliberate tribute to this. But, okay, let's talk about Evil Dead. Let's talk about the Raimi Craven Wars. So, in the original Evil Dead, which you just saw on the TV screen there, that featured a torn poster for The Hills Have Eyes. That was Evil Dead 1981, Hills Have Eyes 1977. Now, Raimi notices the tribute. Craven notices a tribute. So in this, we get Evil Dead on the screen. And then Evil Dead 2 will amp things up by featuring a Freddy glove hanging in a shed. Incidentally, Sleepaway Camp 2 did the same, but I'm not sure that one was ever reciprocated, and I can't exactly recommend that one. You know, watching this with young Johnny Depp and Langenkamp, I have often thought that you feel like you're being teased that Glenn is going to be the final character. We've had a lot of focus on Nancy, obviously, but I do feel like Glenn is so rounded out that there's a real chance that it could be him. I mean, we see his parents, we see her parents. It's that little extra investment that makes you think, oh, this is less a supporting character and this actually could be the one who makes it to the end. It would have been interesting if he had, but I guess this may be unconventional, but it's not so unconventional that we're not going to have a final girl, right? In terms of that unconventionality, it's hard to pick out now, but in context, the fact that they had a smaller number of characters was a little different. The bigger series, Halloween, Friday the 13th, they were throwing large numbers of characters on the screen who were basically fodder. You know, they were just there as meat, so that you could have an extra number of kills in there. Craven is really going against that and only giving you a small number of characters, only 4 that you need to be concerned about, so they can all be developed a bit more and you all invest in them a bit longer. I mean, for a challenge, just try naming as many characters as you can from Friday the 13th Part 2. Give it a go. Alright. So again, we're seeing that dream logic a la Inception. And as I said, there's a thing where the film logic and dream logic really works together. This is something Christopher Nolan played with a lot in Inception. So some dream logic here. Nancy has told Glenn to be watching over her, to take care of her. And he said yes. So, okay, in the dream world, yeah, he's hiding behind a bush and steps out when she calls him. This is dream logic. He should be in the bedroom. She's just projected a dream version of him that cannot actually help her. But it makes sense in the dream logic. Further film logic and dream logic that work together is how you can just skip from one scene to another, from one location to another. In Inception, this is explicitly called out in a conversation between Leonardo DiCaprio and Ellen Page, where he's explaining to her that simple thing that you don't interrogate in a film, just how did we get here? And you don't think about it because in a film, you're really used to just cutting between locations. And the same thing holds for a dream, which Nightmare on Elm Street makes great use of. Think of how we went from the school, which had sort of indoor elements such as the wind and the leaves, into the basement. Or any of the houses lead to the basement. Or how she can just go through this rickety door there and suddenly be in front of the police station. These places should not link up, but in dream logic and film logic, it does. Nightmare on Elm Street just takes it that little more surreal so that it stands out to you. I really appreciated it. That sequence of Nancy going down the street, I quite like it as a relatively unhurried sequence. In an otherwise very sharp film, they wanted to give you a bit of time to breathe. By the way, this bit here of Freddy going through the bars, I always think of the Buffy episode Killed by Death from season 2. a very deliberate tribute. I mean, the what's it called? Der Kinderstod has the same hat as Freddy Krueger, also haunts things in their dreams, kids in their dreams even. Very obvious tribute. Of course, most of Buffy Season 2 was very deliberately trying to do the classic monsters, whether the universal ones or the more iconic recent ones like Freddy Krueger. This recurrence of Tina here, very grim by the way, also makes it very clear that Freddy is able to appear in different guises. You're getting a lot of the rules of the film spelled out for you here, which is quite nice. Just incidentally, you're able to pick it up. Though you do have to have a jump scare, of course. It's not that atypical. We'll wait for Wes Craven's new nightmare to be fully atypical. Now, this is, again, wonderful dream logic. You always, well, I don't know, in a nightmare, you run away. That's a common experience. But the fact that you're unable to actually pick up any speed, you feel slowed down, you feel trapped. It's so weird that Freddy wears a face there. It's really creepy. Again, emphasising that he can put on the guises. So you have to be extra, how can I say, extra cautious when you're seeing other characters in your dream. Now you don't know if it's actually Freddy in disguise. But, yeah, the issue with running away where you just can't do it. And by the way, again, breaking out behind the mirror, it's just making full use of the scenario here. We're in a dream, so Freddy can basically come from anywhere, but it looks so realistic that you as the audience are still not fully prepared for it. We'll have many such scares of this, and it's so effective. You wonder when they go into the real world, shouldn't there be feathers everywhere? Bear that in mind, given the rules that we've already had established, that what happens in the dream world impacts your world. Okay. So as I was saying, attempting to run away in dreams, especially nightmares, very tricky. I certainly find that myself, where I have a nightmare where I try and run away. I've always kind of explained that as the fact that you've probably got your feet under a blanket, which is holding them in place. I think that means like you might be sympathetically trying to move your legs and you can't because of the blanket. And so in the dream, you then also can't run. That's how I always understand it. Maybe that's a bit more, you know, going in for Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. But that always makes sense to me. And now here is the mother again. Absolutely useless. I think if you listen to the Red Letter Media commentary on this, they highlight how that photo of Glenn is just Johnny Depp's casting photo, shopped around. Interesting production detail, but I don't know if it helps you understand the film all that much. You increasingly note, by the way, Blue is really tied to Nancy. Now, a lot of the dream scenes are heavily tinted blue as well, but watch out for like her dresses, her colour combos, her duvet. Watch how she will be coded a lot more in blue over the course of the film. Now, is that to say that she's still in the dream realm or that she's more used to it? Hard to say. You can take that a number of ways, but it's something I noticed. Now, we just had the mother portrayed as rather useless. We are also getting that cop portrayed as pretty useless. Again, building up a picture, the boomers are not taking great care of the kids. As in many cases, the kids are going to have to do their own solving of the problem. That's something very common in horror movies, but I feel Wes Craven in this is going to go out and out to do a lot more with it, to really examine it and explore it a lot more and foreground something that is kind of assumed in a lot of horrors. Think of Halloween. Parents are basically absent. Anyway, getting back to this effect here, this is a really simple effect. This is just a wire threaded inside that duvet and then wrapped around and then pulled off, and then it's filmed in reverse. Or rather, it's filmed and the footage is reversed. So that's how it looks like the thing's going forward and actively winding around. Really simple effect, but it does the job. It does the job very well. But Rod doesn't get much of a showing, does he? It's quite nasty. Now, I'll highlight something else for you here. He was pulled up and hanged. Keep an eye out for this, but whenever these characters die, they're going to ascend. In the dream world, they descend. They go downstairs and walkways as they go into Freddy's lair. But when they actually die, they tend to go upwards. Tina was pulled up to the ceiling. Glenn will have everything, his guts sprayed up onto the ceiling too. And Rod being hanged also gets drawn upwards. Now I thought that was maybe a slight sort of leftover from Craven's religiosity, where the idea is that the characters are going to go ascending heavenwards. You know, the nightmares may be in hell, but they're going up towards heaven because they were innocent or undeserving of Kruger's brutality. So that was maybe a nice gesture. What the pastor is going to say here is less of a kind gesture. That is quite harsh quoting. Who lives by the sword shall die by the sword. That's a bit brutal. But he will make it up here with judge not lest ye be judged, which does not mean do not judge. Let's just be clear. But often misinterpreted anyway. Now I want us to note the fact that we're seeing a church, we are seeing a funeral is very significant. All of this is emphasising something really important. Rod had family. Ron had friends, had people who are going to miss him. It's very humanising. It's making him less disposable. He's not just some camp counsellor who's being offed at, mass production level scales. He is someone who is going to be missed. And that is very key to Craven's vision. Now, another thing I want to point out there at the dress, it's not exactly typical funeral attire. I think that's more for coding those colours to Nancy. She's especially helped by her, wonderful blue eyes. I do love that dress, but I don't exactly think of it as typical funeral attire. We're going to get some interesting foreshadowing for the ending here. Look at this, that angle on Nancy. That is foreshadowing the ending. Now, how are they going to respond to that? Very materially, taking her to the doctors. I always find this section is a little odd, a little out of place, but it does make sense. This is realistically what people would do. Now in the scene, even though it feels a bit odd, it feels like it's straight out of The Exorcist, it is very efficient. It is a brief scene. Oh, by the way, look at that nurse. I'll mention it now. That nurse is Mimi Maya, and she would become Mimi Maya Craven. In this copy of the film I've got, she's already credited as Maya Craven. She was Wes Craven's second wife. The third was longer lasting. Just as with Stanley Kubrick, it's the third wife that's a charm. I said Wes Craven was atypical for Hollywood, but he's not that atypical. This marriage did not end well at all. Now in the scene, we established that 2 days have passed since the killing of Tina, and it also gives us a new rule. We learn about being able to take some objects from the dream world into the real world, of course. This is an unusual scenario. We're not dealing with just a masked maniac in the woods with a machete. We all know what happens when the machete goes into your sternum. We're dealing with a dream world, so Craven needs to establish the film logic for us, and that's something he's been doing very nicely, mostly with just without exposition, just showing it. Great screenwriting. However, I am baffled by some elements. I think that I don't exactly believe the scientist saying it's sort of hocus pocus. That sounds a bit odd. I also have no idea why he has that poster. What is that poster? Can you explain it? Why is there a cat bus? Is this a low-key Studio Ghibli tribute? I don't know. Always sticks out to me. Now the other thing that really helps this, as well as giving us the new rule which will help us understand the ending about being able to bring things out of the dream world, we also don't see the dream. We'll get the sound effects, that's very well done, but we don't see the dream, and that is a good move. 1, because it saves on budget. 2, because it makes the film shorter and tighter. But most of all, it's very wise because it helps keep Freddy scary. Nancy's already escaped Freddy twice at this point. If we see her escape him, she's escaped Freddy twice. If she does it again, it really dampens the threat. We do not want that. We want the next meeting to be serious. So if she's just constantly escaping him, makes him less scary. So very good decision. That convulsing, by the way, really makes me think of The Exorcist. It really does. Now, there's another thing I wanted to talk about at the funeral, but... Oh, hey, they threaded in the grey there. Excellent. I'd noticed it at the end. It becomes a very strongly defined when she returns in Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors. But I like that they built that in there. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about one aspect of Freddy that we haven't touched yet. We've explained the hat. Should we talk about the knives for fingers? One of the most original aspects of him. That is... How can I say? That is, let's talk about Freddy Krueger as a sexual threat, or a symbol for sexual threat. There's quite a far swing from the Vietnam interpretation, isn't it? So I think the knives for fingers symbolism should be absolutely obvious. Hopefully you don't want me to spell it out, but where you are violated by fingers, they will feel like weapons, so they're being used as a weapon on someone in a sexual violence context. So obviously they are portrayed as knives. And that shouldn't be that is not the only thing in this interpretation. It's kind of we've also got the fact that he gets his tongue inside of the phone, tells Nancy he's her boyfriend now. She gets his tongue in her mouth. That is just very straightforward. The fact that he attacks him in bed a lot is also very obvious symbolism. And that aspect of Krueger as a sort of threat to children, not just in terms of killing them, but also as a sexual threat, is often obscured. It's often overlooked. They don't tend to talk about it much and leave it a bit obscure whether he's only a child murderer. I mean, this film is unpleasant enough, to be honest, but, you know, that is an aspect that we should consider. Now, having seen all the weird stuff in the Institute, having actually seen that fedora from Freddy Krueger pulled out of thin air, we've got to ask, how are the parents actually going to deal with this? I mean, this is a confrontation, right? They're sticking to strict materialism. The kids are saying there's something weird going on here. How are you actually going to cope with genuine evidence? We see that right now. They cope with it by hiding it, by denying it, by getting drunk, by immediately starting drinking. We'll see quite a lot of hidden bottles in this. We're not meant to, we're meant to see them. But I find it a really interesting aspect of this, how the adults keep telling the children not to notice things are going wrong, to basically not refuse their worldview. And do you find it a little dated that someone has written their name inside their hat? Do you do that? When was the last time you wrote your name inside clothing? I don't think that habit's passed on. Anyway, the aspect of Nancy chugging coffee there, I quite like it. The element of sleep denial is important, and she tries to play it as somewhat strenuous, but I do feel that is slightly underplayed here, and I would like a little more of it. One strength for me of the 2010 remake is that they really make a heck of a lot of the extreme impact of the sleep deprivation. Like, you really see it wearing on the characters. You see them go to the chemist to try and get something to desperately stay awake. I really like that. There's not many defenders of the 2010 remake, but I do my best. I try. The mother asserting it's just a nightmare really does not help, does it? One of the main premises of this, and the ideas that Craven got across in New Nightmare, is that dreams and stories do impact the real world. The real world will impact your dream and stories, but they in turn have a feedback loop for you. And that idea of the dreams and stories actually influencing the real world, influencing real opinion, that is, hardly fringe now, especially following something like manufacturing consent, or just all the importance we see nowadays on how movies have to have the right message. Hollywood has always done that. Pick your own favourite example, really. But Craven is not alone in sort of highlighting it. So when you're saying you can write it off and say it's just a nightmare. No. Maybe a nightmare, but it has impacts. Now here with Glenn, he has had a bit of a glow up here. He's gone from recognising it, you just recognise it's a nightmare and then you wake up, to bring up this idea of Balinese dream skills. Glenn has been researching. Pre-internet, that's pretty impressive. Where do you think he came across that? But he is able to feed her the information and set us up again for the finale. This is good setup and payoff. But I quite like that Nancy has gone instead for a survival manual. And interestingly, that's quite gender flipped, isn't it? You might expect that she's looked up the non-combative solution and Glenn has been looking up how to get explosives. But it's the other way around. It's just an interesting thing about this. Nancy is far from a typical horror heroine. Well, look at that. I guess about 30 houses down they probably have some very spicy neighbours, but that's a side matter. Noticing all the securitization of the house there, all the bars and locks. That's frustrating her plans. Once again, the adults are not being helpful. I do find her quite convincing, I've got to say. I also find it weird. The mother always has the same design of bottle. The fact that it just has gin written on it. Gosh. I know you have to do the kind of, you don't want to really get a brand label in a film, so you have to do a sort of stand-in. But that is, it has that sort of coffee brand coffee, right? It's a little weird that it just says gin on the bottle. I've always found that a bit weird. I feel this is probably the best time for us to talk about Craven's treatment of absent parents and parents in horror. Let's do it now. Absent parents did absolutely nothing wrong in this. Okay, so it's 1984 when this comes out. The slasher genre has already gone absolutely everywhere. The tropes are very well known, and a common factor in them is the absence of parents. And in some ways, you know, this always happens. You need the protagonists to solve things for themselves. And since we move into teenage protagonists, we kind of need parents out of the picture so that they can self-actualize, so they can solve their own problem. Okay, we've got some really good stuff here. I want you to notice both the booze bottle tucked away there. We know she hides booze. She probably just brought that one down with her actually, but we'll see her hide stuff elsewhere. And we're also going to keep an eye out for the sledgehammer that will be used in the finale. Looking at this theme, the parents saying, yes, there was something awful, we had to do something, but we did it to protect you, and then we lied to you. And Craven is not a fan of this. He's reacting against this. He's pitching that as a problem. I think that should come into shot here. There we go. Just in frame. Fantastic stuff. Absent parents. And, you know, back in the case of Enid Blyton, the famous five, you know, the parents were out of the way there. However, here, horror has moved into the suburbs. You're not going out for far countryside adventures. It's in the suburbs. It's in the family home. And so the parents really should be there. And it's a bit of a standout when you watch something like Halloween. You always wonder, where are the parents? Now Craven has noticed that and he deals with it head on. Instead of just unconsciously replicating the absent parent, Craven is interrogating it, and he's explaining it by saying the parents are irresponsible or the parents are drunk. And he's deciding here that the parents are kind of the problem. Craven in A Nightmare on Elm Street shows that the parents are guilty, that they've sinned by killing Freddy Krueger, by going vigilante mode, and then numbing themselves with booze to cope. They may even have divorced as a result of the trauma, of course, Craven's parents did as well. Craven isn't a total hippie, as he doesn't think that just liberalising so parents out of the home and divorce is absolutely fine. He has shown, just as he has with the absence of religion, that when you take something away, there is an absence, and it can be filled with bad substitutes. As in, God is dead, so Freddy is God now. Absent parents means a kids hole up watching TV. School takes over the learning and imprisons them, and they learn meaningless nonsense. That is all in this film. But Craven also truly believes in the family. He believes in how important it is, even if he doesn't always show families dealing with things ideally. Parental conflict and family relationships are a near constant in his films. Whether it's Last House on the Left, where the parents have to avenge their daughter, or The Hills Have Eyes, which is a sort of family v family situation. All of those show how important a wholesome family is. In Last House on the Left, if the parents had been a fair bit stricter, their daughter would definitely be alive. Now yes, Craven shows parents failing a lot, but it's never a good thing, it's never an inconsequential thing. And that's what I think gives his films so much heart, and I really respect him for that. By the way, look at that vulture behind Glenn. You ever noticed that before? Do you think it's interesting that he's got a vulture behind him? Anyway, commentator John Doyle had a really interesting reading of Last House on the Left and said it was far too nihilistic, and I absolutely adored his video, I adore his channel, but I did have a minor issue with calling it nihilistic. I think that the parents do regret how savage they have had to become when they're avenging their daughter, and I think that's fine. I think it's never a good thing, even when it's necessary. You shouldn't be relishing the violence. That is an absolute constant in Craven stuff. The only person who relishes the violence in A Nightmare on Elm Street is Freddy Krueger. Now, the other controversy is that in A Nightmare on Elm Street, Craven does believe that the parents have done something wrong. And that seems a little weird because in Last House on the Left, the parents avenging their child, that was grim but necessary. It doesn't feel at all like they have done the wrong thing. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, it seems very explicit that they have done the wrong thing. They have sinned in going vigilante and killing and burning Freddy Krueger. I have a massive problem with that. Not a chance. Krueger's guilt isn't in any doubt. We are told explicitly in the film that he was let off on a procedural technicality. Maybe not the most reliable source in the entire film, but Nancy's mother says, the lawyer got fat, the judge got famous, but someone forgot to sign the search warrant in the right place. And that is why Freddy Krueger went free. So we are in no way debating whether or not he is guilty. He absolutely is guilty, but the system's procedure was not strictly followed. Now, if we stick with the system's procedure, no justice. Is that what we really should be wanting? Absolutely not. No, the kerosene makeover, 100% justified. Very based parents, very based. I do think that is something pretty harsh of Craven, to be honest. And that is my major issue with the statements in this film. Like when Craven here is going to highlight that Glenn's parents are far too lax and just not caring and letting him watch all kinds of garbage, all kinds of, well, basically soft porn on the TV. And it's just sort of sitting, absolutely dominating him, sitting on his chest. I think that is absolutely fine. Implying they're wrong to crispy fry a nonce, absolutely not. Sorry, Wes, not on board. I adore her taking that coffee machine out. I absolutely love it. That's all the nudity you get from Nancy there, and it's so minimal. That really is a big contrast to the other horror where you get your sort of people brought on and someone's always going to flash their bubs. You know, it's so restrained. As we talked about with the Tina scene, it could have been made so much more lascivious, and Craven refused to. Really helps this. It really does work for this film well. Anyway, let's also note that shirt with 10 on it. I did mention it earlier. Craven will pay a tribute to that later in Scream. Glenn's outfit is going to be worn by Tatum. It's a really cute little tribute. Now, still on the idea of what parents should do, let's dig in a bit. We're going to quote again from Wes Craven's New Nightmare. So Heather asks, then in this nightmare in progress, does this thing have any weaknesses? And Craven says, yeah, it can be captured. He talks about the thing, he's talking about Freddy Krueger. And Craven says, it can be captured by storytellers of all things. Every so often they imagine a story good enough to catch its essence. Then it's held prisoner for a while in the story. The problem comes when the story dies, and it happens a lot of different ways. The story gets too familiar or too watered down by people trying to make it easier to sell, or it's labelled a threat to society and just plain banned. However it happens, when the story dies, the evil is set free. So Craven is coming up against conservatism there. He doesn't want you just banning things. He's concerned about the way his movies get censored, but at the same time he doesn't want the horror in them to be treated flimsily or just not taken seriously at all. The system will cheapen the idea and free the demon, but banning it will too. For me, it really reflects the line in Scream, the famous line, "Movies don't create psychos, movies make psychos more creative." Craven is trying to get across that the ideas are out there, and the ideas will always be out there, and they need to be reflected. They can be made less dangerous if you are talking about them creatively and honestly, and taking them seriously. Craven was quoted in Clive Barker's A to Z of Horror, saying that he just felt Freddy was the paradigm of the threatening adult. Freddy stood for the savage side of male adulthood. He was the ultimate bad father. It's a sickness where youth is hated. Childhood and innocence are hated. How's that for timing when you see this guy? Maybe that's a bit of boomerism coming out. As I said, it's hard to place Craven on a typical left-right scale. I mean, maybe just standard anti-censoriousness, but I guess you expect that from Hollywood. So Craven is intending the horror to stay horrific, not commercial, not cheap, and with that, I think he is absolutely directly criticising the horror at the time. And part of this is his famous rule, the Wes Craven rule, and I want you to look out for this. His rule, the Wes Craven rule, is to always remember that whatever horrible fate happens to someone on screen, it is happening to a real person who matters to people, who has family and friends who will miss them. Basically, no one should just be machete fodder, and I think that makes his films so much stronger. As I said, Craven really did not want to just be the horror guy, and you can tell from him trying so hard to get out of it, taking all sorts of projects. He was so delighted to actually be able to make an uplifting drama musical called Music of the Heart, I want to say in 2010. That was a really important project to him because he didn't want to be constrained. But unfortunately for him, the horror genre is what people wanted from him. So whilst he was doing that, he made the best horrors he could. He made serious horrors. I think there's almost a theme of the best horror directors are people who don't want to be horror directors. There's that fantastic tongue effect. It is a cheap gag, it is a very short effect, but it doesn't need to be on screen long, and it does its job. It's really good, I think. Really good. It sticks in my mind. Again, I do love Nancy's aesthetic, even if I found that puppet very weird. In that scene as well, I want to wonder why Nancy's arm is still bleeding freshly, and I always thought that's because she was pressing on it to stay awake. Like her supply of coffee had been cut off, she didn't have any more of the stay awake pills, so she's pressing on it to keep the pain coming. That's an idea that was used of inflicting pain to stay awake. That was obviously used in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 Dream Warriors, and it was also very heavily leaned on in the 2010 remake. I really like the way Heather Langenkamp does a teenage frustration and rage there. I think she absolutely nails it, it's brilliant. And there's the image I talked about where Johnny Depp's character is just absolutely dominated by the TV. Just absolutely, yeah. That's what's holding him down, that's what's influencing him and brainwashing him. Great little scene. Something else that's very clever in this is that they were going out of their way to save on the budget. If you watch the documentary Never Sleep Again, which is a history of the whole Elm Street series, they go into a lot of the effects work and it's really quite well done. This is the same set as Tina's room. Obviously, if you're wanting all that blood shooting up at the ceiling, you want to just release it from the ceiling and then turn the room upside down. And that's what they did there. If you're going to take all the expense of building out that massive rotating room, you want to get all the use out of it, and they made sure they did. On the slight downside, even though it's an absolutely wonderful effect, releasing 200 gallons of fake blood into that room does make it hard to work with. So when they needed to rotate it, they couldn't because it was too heavy. It caused all sorts of chaos and shenanigans. But, even if it did that, we did get a quite amazing, memorable effect. Yeah, there's our confirmation. Glenn is not our final girl. He is not making it. Bad luck. Bad luck. Robert Englund said that when he plays Freddy, he doesn't play him as a maniac. He says, "The evil has come home. Freddy is the sins of the parents revisited on the children. Freddy is a child murderer, and that means he's killing innocents, killing the future. I don't play Freddy as a symbol, I play Freddy as a man who hates the future of youth." As I say, both of them, everyone involved in this, is taking it seriously, and that makes this such a strong film. I think I mentioned earlier the qualities of humour in this. Well, here we have a cop setting up a bucket under the blood leaking. I found that really funny. It's very dark, but very funny if you ask me. Sick sense of humour, Wes Craven. Very sick sense of humour, but kind of welcome. I think the humour aspect of this film is really underappreciated. You tend to think of maybe Freddy Krueger being the wisecracker, but everyone else gets some good jokes in. Just wanted to note here in this section, the securitizing of the home. So Nancy's plans have been foiled by the parents, as we noted, but there's something else interesting in the fact that she's got the iron bars all over the home locking her in. And that is relevant to the Vietnam allegory, that the actions abroad, the war abroad, always ends up coming home. The punishment ends up coming home. And the example that comes to mind for me as a Brit is that we had all these anti-terrorism laws, which were promised would be used against big, scary, radical Islamists. And then they were used immediately to arrest someone protesting at a Labour Party conference and kick him out. Just an old pensioner was kicked out under using terrorism laws, and they are used to monitor and crack down on the populace. Possibly not what you expected to come up in a Nightmare on Elm Street commentary, but there we go. Now, interestingly, Nancy is going to propose the ending. The parents are absolutely useless. They don't know how to solve things. Our protagonist is going to have all the agency, and she's got the plan. Now, when she says she needs to be woken up in about 20 minutes, exactly 20 minutes actually, how long do we have left in the movie? Oddly enough, we have 20 minutes. If we're rounding up to the minute, we have 20 minutes. AKA, you'll wake up from the dream in 20 minutes. Well, when the film ends, we all wake up from the dream. I thought that was really nifty. Was that super intentional? Probably not, but it's very neat. There's very similar logic and messaging used at the end of The Cabin in the Woods. They talk about dawn and the lights coming up. Well, when the film ends in the cinema, the lights come up as well. I guess that messaging doesn't land as well when you watch it on streaming. Anyway, I'm going to nitpick here, even though I really like that sort of more subtle messaging about the film ending in 20 minutes and the story ending in 20 minutes as well. Here's a slight problem. If she's making all of these traps afresh, is she really going to do it in under 20 minutes? Do you think she could set all these things up in under an hour? I mean, they look quite difficult. She's doing all this precision work. No way does she have that phone call with her dad and then just set all that up and then do... No. Timing does not work. I'm sorry. It's a cool idea, but the timing is way off. I really like this movie, but, you know, I do have to nitpick these things. And if watching this does make you think of any other movies, I'll just reassure you that it was Home Alone that came out 5 years after this. If you're wondering who got the idea from whom, I also take it as another sign of the 80s that, you know, you've got to have a montage. It's an 80s film. Of course we've got to have a montage. So again, in the realm of how atypical A Nightmare on Elm Street is, think of how much agency that Nancy is showing. You know, in Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode in Halloween, the adventure, the threat was thrust upon her. Exactly the same in Friday the 13th. It's always thrust upon them. You know, Child's Play Part 2, bit more active in taking on the threat, but mostly the final girl is kind of the passive remainder. Here, Nancy is being active. She has the agency. She is making a plan that she's going to execute. Another way that it just shows you how different this is, how Craven did not want to make a typical horror movie. We're getting two setups here, slightly heavy-handed, but you're getting the mother re-emphasising the message that sometimes you have to turn away from things. And you've also got the issue of the booze. Just reminding us of that, of how key that is, of her still being ready to drink before sleep, which will give us a clue about reality at the end, a little tip-off. But you're also noticing the aspect of now, Nancy has tucked her in. It's not subtle, but it's the idea of the child has had to parent the parent. Craven saying that you can't just let the boomer adults lead the way because they will not make the right choices, they will not be helpful. Even the very competent John Saxon in this movie has basically handed off duties to the rather lax and useless deputy. I think he's the one played by Joseph Whipp. I'm pretty darn sure. Now here's another thing that stands out. Again, how atypical. Actually praying. Tell me, when did you last see someone pray in a movie? This is from 1984. When did you last see someone pray in a movie? There's some relevance. It's built in, particularly because of the heaven and hell symbolism with Freddy Krueger and the use of the crucifix and the rhyme. Remember 5-6. Grab your crucifix. But interesting to see someone actually pray in a movie and it not be a mega thing. And the only other example that comes to mind for me is Friday the 13th part 6, where I believe one of the children is spared by Jason as they pray. And that's about all I can think of there. As we've gone into this final dream sequence, or maybe I shouldn't even say final, notice again we get a colour palette change to just slightly clue us in. This is a dream sequence, and it is that blue and white colour palette that, as I've said, is very associated with Nancy throughout the film, helped by her wonderful blue eyes. And as she's going into the dream, just as everyone else has, she is descending. She's gone down the stairs from the top floor, now into the basement, looking for Krueger's glove, not finding it, implying that Freddy has the glove again. And all you get is the sound. Now, Craven has worked to make sure that you know exactly what that sound is. By the way, do you think that was an empty dream catcher on the end of the door? Kind of a useless dream capture, maybe? That's always what I thought that was. Okay, she's now descending again. That's the third time. She's going to make another one. But is that consistent symbolism of when you're going towards Freddy, you're descending. So that is that idea of a very literal descent into hell, which would be how hell was depicted when Craven grew up, that it was a very literal physical place that you descended into. Of course, think of Dante, you do descend into hell. Although in Dante what distinguishes it is that hell gets colder as you go down, and you actually pass through it into purgatory and then into paradise. But we will not be Dante posting anymore in this. Now, I looked at what other horror commentators had said about Nightmare on Elm Street. E. Michael Jones' Monsters from the Id is a very insightful book, but he doesn't address this film at all. And the only thing I found him saying about Wes Craven is that he tried to make sense of slasher logic in Scream without much success. I thought that was a bit harsh. I don't really go for that myself. I think he was doing Wes Craven down a bit. And so I looked also to Kim Newman for Nightmare movies. I have 2 editions of this, the original and the updated one. This original one is from 1988. Now Newman sets this all in the context of the other slashers. So he talks about Jason and he talks about Michael first, which of course they preceded this. They'd all gone a few sequels deep by this point, so obviously he talks about them first. But then he follows it up with, Jason's reincarnation as a supernatural creature probably has something to do with the success of rival psycho Freddy Krueger, a child murderer who lives on in the dreams of the children of the lynch mob who burned him to death. Freddy made his debut in Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street, and was responsible for the resurrection of the just petered out psycho trend. Like Halloween, A Nightmare on Elm Street is a well-crafted scary movie set in a middle American teenage milieu that happened to click with the movie-going public. It has a witty, resourceful heroine in Heather Langenkamp. At one point during her ordeal, she looks at a mirror and remarks, "God, I look 20 years old." It has some Donald Pleasant-style comfortably familiar hamming from John Saxon and Renee Blakely as her parents, a wonderfully menacing, lewd and horror comic villain in Freddy, and a whole barrel of the tricky is it a dream or isn't it sequences. sequences Craven had used to good effect in his earlier movies. If it finally seems a less satisfying film than Halloween, it may be because its interplay between dream and reality entails a lot of on and off moods reversals that don't work up the cumulative suspense of Carpenter's film. And I think that's probably quite a fair comment actually, even though I would say there's a heck of a lot more depth to A Nightmare on Elm Street. This is Newman again. Uniquely in the psycho field, Freddy Krueger is a monster with a personality to go with his trademarks: a clawed gardening glove, a battered hat, a stripy jersey and a fried face. The actors who created the roles of Leatherface, Michael Myers and Jason haven't returned in the sequels, but only Englund could play Freddy. He's been back in the disappointing, unusually gay-themed A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2 Freddy's Revenge, directed by Jack Shoulder of Alone in the Dark, and the flamboyant, effects-laden Three-Ring Circus, A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 Dream Warriors, directed by Chuck Russell with most of the surviving cast of the original film and some story input from Craven. And of course a fantastic turn by Lawrence Fishburne. The Elm Street films use the dream theme to have fun with surreal images of the sort sometimes found on comic book covers. The clawed hand coming out of the bath, the telephone receiver with the tongue, the monster leaning out of the wall in A Nightmare on Elm Street, or the old dark house of the psyche finale of Dream Warriors, which seems to take place inside Freddy's head. The series typifies a horror film of the 1980s, obsessed with makeup effects, loaded down with crowd-pleasing humour, fundamentally safe and silly. And a comparison with Craven's earlier work suggests the decade has fostered an unfortunate tendency to settle for less. The dream theme, however, has become a psycho commonplace thanks to Freddy. In 1988, the Dream Demon, Dream Invaders, Bad Dreams and Deadly Dreams were all announced or in production. Well, I can't say I'm familiar with any of those 4 films dropped at the end, but evidently this film did have an impact. Now, I do have to very much disagree with calling A Nightmare on Elm Street fundamentally safe and silly. I think I've shown that while the humour is strong in this, there are big ideas in this film, there are big serious themes in this film, and there is a lot of intelligence happening here. I would not write this off as just silly at all. Now, away from Kim Newman, who does tend to prefer things very, very gritty. Note that having descended about 5 or 6 times in Freddy's dream realm, that Nancy has now jumped out of that and is suddenly back upstairs on the top level of her house. That always makes me think of Silent Hill 2. It's easily overlooked, but you have a level where you go down on a long descent, down some spiralling stairs, long ramps, all the way to a boss fight in the depths of a prison, and then you come out and you're just suddenly on ground level again. It's absolutely impossible geometry, it messes you up, and it's a really nice subtle observation that, you know, the descent is really just a sort of metaphor. It's really just a psychological descent that the character went on. And I think that holds the same for Nancy here in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Look at that. Cops, once again useless. Absolutely useless. He's just given her the assurances and she's like, "Get my dad, you asshole." We're all there with her. We're all lacking patience with them at this point. Robert Englund is taking a heck of a lot of punishment in this film now, isn't he? He had some very, very long makeup days on this. He's kind of a hippie at the time, had his long ponytail. And he was having to sit in that chair for absolutely hours for about 6 weeks. Getting about 6 hours sleep and then coming back on set. Now, I don't think that is actually Robert Englund. I think you would have to be a proper stunt player to do that, but they are doing that for a very long time, aren't they? They're doing that for an extremely long time. They're doing it for a very long time. It's an extended burn. It is very impressive. I think even if you got a little cut there, my suspicion is that was probably all cut in one. And it's a very long burn. The mask sort of gives it away in that tumble just at the end down the stairs, but it is very impressive. Now later on, Friday the 13th Part 7 would go on to deliberately try and top this, aiming for the longest on-screen burn that Kane Hodder did. Part 7 I think is fairly underrated. I'm not saying it's a masterpiece, but something I liked about 6 and 7 is that they did try something very different. They tried to be much more standout visions. Now, why have we had all those traps, by the way? There is a bit of a tension here in the fact that we didn't really need to do this. Everything we've been set up for is that we don't need this, that the defeat of Freddy isn't going to be via a physical fight. That's why I talked about how Freddy goes out of his way to injure himself, because the physical stuff does not matter to him. He's not going to be beaten by that. But unfortunately, the cinema audience, they need this. They want the physical confrontation. You need that for the release of tension. That is what we expect. It's kind of what we need for it to make sense. This bed here is obviously Glenn's bed being reused. Told you they were on a very tight budget, so they're being very smart in reusing what they can. But that's a pretty nice fade. We're going to have an electrical light effect in a minute that isn't going to look as good. But I thought that fade looked very smooth. So as I said, the audience, we want a physical fight. We do expect some physical punishment of Freddy. So we got that thrown in there. That satisfies us. But now we should get what Craven actually wanted. Because again, he didn't want to make the typical horror film. So that ultimate victory is going to be a refusal to engage. It's assertively refusing to be drawn in to Freddy's nightmare. But the trouble is, that is less satisfying for us as an audience. I'm mindful of, this might sound like it comes out of nowhere, but the Path of Neo game, where the Wachowskis come in to tell you via sort of 8-bit characters that ultimately the Matrix requires a sort of philosophical resolution, but that's kind of hard to do in a video game and not very satisfying. So here's a boss fight, and I always get that vibe. I'm always kind of reminded of that when I watch this. And ultimately we find they will not be able to stick with Wes's vision here. And we are going to go back to a slightly more conventional horror movie ending, but we got to remember that was not Craven's vision. I think what he wanted to do with this is, having talked about the importance of dreams, the importance of stories and nightmares, and how they will influence our world, is to remember that they are limited, they have a set place, and we should be conscious of them and how they impact us. And it really reminds me of the way the credits in Scream are. After you've had the film all about, just like this and the power of nightmares, Scream is about the power of movies, and they end it by showing you a slightly old-fashioned dramatis personae of the cast. So they show you a picture of the actor as in character, and they do that for the whole cast, and the idea is to reinforce for you this is just a movie. These actors were just playing the characters, and it's just like Nancy saying it's just a dream. Scream tells you, hey, it's just a movie. It's not saying it doesn't mean anything, but it's telling people who would censor this that this is not reality, and it's not meant to be reality. I don't know if you really needed me to say that given that very 80s electrical effect, but there we go, I said it anyway. Certainly looked a lot better than the Hellraiser electrical effect, didn't it? Anyway, we do not get that as our ultimate ending. This, by the way, should instantly clue us in. Look at how the hair's different. Look at how refreshed she looks. We are outside. Everyone is looking better. The mum is now alive. I mean, this is just ridiculously saturated. The way the mum is just going to casually say, yeah, I don't feel like booze anymore. That's it. I just don't feel like drinking anymore. We're obviously in a kind of wish fulfillment scenario here. I guess because Nancy has control over the dream again. But I don't think we doubt at any point in this that this is still a dream. We had that classic dream logic where you go from one location into another location that's completely disconnected from it. So we should be clued in. We are not meant to think this is reality. I told you, Rod's funeral, we were foreshadowed about a scare in the car. There it is. Originally she was just meant to walk out into the fog, but no, we get this. This is Bob Shaye's request. Because Craven really didn't have any bargaining power at this point, he was at a career low point when he made this, Bob Shaye was able to say, we need a sequel hook ending, we need this, give us some scares. And that's what we got. And it's all the sequel bait you need. We start on a dream, we finish on a dream, and we see those children. Maybe implying that basically it was all a dream. Could be. There's a Mimi Mayer Craven there, credited. Just watch out in a minute, we're going to see a special thanks for Sam Raimi and Sean Cunningham. Now that you've listened to this commentary, you're going to have the context for that, for why they matter so much to this production. Now, with that ending, there are obviously some implications. You just have to worry, what does that mean for Nancy? Did she die? Did Freddy get her? I mean, that is not answered by the second one, which feels like it's from a completely different universe. But Nancy, or rather Heather Langenkamp, would return as Nancy in part 3, and as both herself and, in a way, as Nancy in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which I've got to say is extremely underanalyzed and very worth a look. I always find it incredibly telling that Wes Craven wrote and directed and starred in Wes Craven's New Nightmare immediately before starring in Scream. Those films are both trying to say a heck of a lot about the state of horror cinema and how it's interpreted, so I would really recommend that you have a look at that. But as for that, absolute classic, wonderful film, so much more going on in it, so much more beyond the surface. I think the generational tension that's in this film is really interesting, and it's easy to overlook it. I hope I've given you things that help you appreciate this film on a new level, or maybe you're just saying, oh, that was an absolute reach, what the heck you want? Well, I try. I like an unconventional look at films. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you check out the other commentaries in the series, and of course watch the episodes that this is part of. This was all recorded as part of the Rental Breakdown project, which is talking about the history and cultural impact of blockbuster video, so do check that out as well, and thank you very much. Cheers. My voice is kind of dying from doing these. If you're interested, this is the 6th one that I've recorded in the project, even though it's going to come second in the release order, for anyone keeping track of that.